All right. Coffee, notes, ready to go. If you had a cancerous tumor inside of you, and it was clear on the MRI that that's what it was, the oncologist knew that he could take that cancerous tumor out of you, but for some reason decided not to do that. You might think that he was an evil oncologist. If he knew he could take it out, you would want him to do everything he could to take that cancerous tumor out, even if it meant a difficult surgery, and even if it meant that you were going to have a difficulty in recovery, maybe for months to come. You would still want him to do everything he could to take that cancer out of your body. Well, in the same way, God is that way with sin. God sees the cancerous tumor of sin that's in our heart, and that makes a misery of our own lives and of our relationships, some of the closest ones that we have. And he is at work every day to try to remove that cancerous tumor that lives in us as sin. And sometimes that is a painful process, and sometimes the process continues long after the initial surgery happens. But we think of is that God is doing what is right and what is holy. Today we look at the character quality of the holiness of God. 1 Peter says, as he who called you is holy, be holy yourselves in all your conduct, since it is written, you shall be holy, for I am holy. Now this is typically quite a fuzzy, what is the holiness of God, and what does it mean for me to be holy? And so we'll look at this. What is holiness? There are three things that the scriptures point out about the holiness of God. First is that God is separate from us and above us. He is different from us. He is set apart from us. Hosea says, I will not carry out my fierce anger nor devastate Ephraim again, for I am God and not man. There's a difference there, a distinction. The Holy One among you, I will not come in wrath. Now we know in Genesis that in some ways we are made in the image of God, and in some ways we are very much like him. We are personal creatures like he is. We are rational, volitional, emotional, and relational creatures like he is. But in other ways, we are quite different from who God is. He is creator. I am very much a creature. He is omniscient. He knows everything. I have a good day when I remember what I'm supposed to do on any given day. He is omnipresent. He can be fully present everywhere around the globe. Me, I do good if I just show up when I'm supposed to. He is omnipotent, all-powerful. When it comes to power in my life or control or trying to fix even the simplest things, my power sometimes seems quite puny. He is separate and above his creation. Second, God is wholly pure. No, the first part of the holiness is that God is bigger than we are. You can think of it that way. That's kind of a shorthand. He's bigger, much bigger and different than we are. Second one is he is pure. And here, you might think of the quality of virtue. What we think of as virtue. Now, when difficulties arise in our life, we forget the holiness of God. And we usually sort of question, God, how come you're not doing something about, why did you let this hurricane come ashore? Why do you let diseases like muscular dystrophy happen? And why aren't you doing something to help somebody that your power could help? Why aren't you doing something about that? And we do this either verbally or sometimes just often in our heart. We question God. And we're sort of like the little freshman in college, the 18-year-old, who's sitting in the class for the first time at the university and is critiquing the professor who's been doing this for 30 years. Thinking about the ways that the professor could be teaching better. Isaiah 5 says, God says, who will not fear you, O Lord, and bring glory to your name? For you alone are holy. All nations will come and worship before you. Why? For your righteous acts have been revealed. Meaning, instead of it being the world where human beings can sit back and critique God and go, oh, why? Isaiah sees a day that's coming when the situation will be reversed. When all of us who have been critiquers of God will see his righteous acts revealed. If we hadn't seen them before, we will see them then. And the effect of that will be for all of us to worship. We will see his holiness then, even if we don't see it now. It will be he who hands out grades, not we who hand out grades to him. So purity, holiness, God is bigger than we are. And second, think of the quality of virtue. On the inside of your handout, the third element is purity means to be focused on God's, or holiness means God's purposes in your life and others. Focused on God's purposes in your life and others. Or sometimes, if you've heard a message on this before, we say, separated for God's purposes instead of my own. It's the same idea. Separated for God's purposes. In Isaiah 58, God gives us an illustration of what this looks like. If you keep your feet from breaking the Sabbath and from doing as you please on my holy day, if you call the Sabbath a delight and the Lord's holy day honorable, and then notice the descriptions that he gives as to how we cannot do this. If you honor it by not going your own way, not doing as you please, or speaking idle words. Now, what's he saying here? He's saying that at least on this day, what I hope on the Sabbath that you will do as my people is you will think about my purposes more so than you think about your purposes. And my needs more so than you think about your needs. And of course, when you think about God's purposes in this world, they have to do with others. And it's a call to do something, if you read the rest of the passage in Isaiah, to do something for the sake of other people more so than you would do for yourself. I am very intrigued by the last phrase in this particular verse. I can understand where he says, by not going your own way or not doing as you please, but notice the last phrase, or speaking idle words. What does that mean? That is an intriguing phrase, and we'll come to that in just a minute. When you think about this, I think about the quality of virtue, like the previous definition of holiness, but it's virtue that is outward focused. You before me. This is the holiness of God and what he's trying to build in you and me. God is bigger than us. Think about virtue, and a virtue that is other-centered. Now, in Isaiah 6, we have a picture of the holiness of God. And I really love how the Bible does this, because we've just spent just a few minutes talking about some teaching points about the holiness of God. And it may be that for the most part, we sit there and we just kind of nod our head and go, oh, that's nice. That's good. Yay, God. Hope that happens. And yet the holiness of God is meant to do something very different to us. And sometimes just teaching points are not enough, but we get a picture or a vision like happened with Isaiah in chapter 6. Chapter 6 begins, in the year that King Uzziah died, who was a very popular king then. And it sort of rocked the nation when Uzziah died. It sort of reminded me of when I was a kid when JFK was killed. Our nation was rocked. And when Reagan had to step away after a second term, it sort of had that almost a similar effect on me. And this is what happens with Isaiah. In the year that King Uzziah died, and he says, I saw the Lord, and here's a vision that he's describing. The word Lord is the Hebrew word Adonai, which means sovereign. The sovereign, or the king. King Uzziah has died, but instead of a call for despair, his vision is lifted up to see the higher king, seated on a throne, high and exalted, and the train of his robe filled the temple. And here we're called upon to use our imagination. I saw the Lord seated on a throne, and I think about the thrones in England and thrones in France hundreds of years ago, the kings and queens that sat on the royal thrones. But he says the throne that's high, meaning higher than what we typically think of as the royal throne in England or in Paris, and exalted. And here he's describing something that's sort of more glorious, more wondrous than what you would normally see in a palace. High and exalted, and the train of his robe filled the temple. And here when I think about a train, I usually think about a wedding gown. And weddings are cool when the bride comes down the aisle, and normally her wedding gown has a train behind it. And the train just sort of drags along, sort of sweeping up the dust behind it in one sense. I mean, that's how guys think of this. But for you ladies, it's a whole different thing. The train of a gown represents something of beauty and glory. Something special is happening here. That's the image that Isaiah is seeing of God. Something of beauty, glory, grandeur. Verse 2. Above him were seraphs. And you say, what's a seraph? The Hebrew word means burning ones. And as we look at what the seraphs are doing, the closest thing you can imagine is angels. The angels are flying around above the throne. Each seraph had 6 wings. With two wings, they covered their faces. With 2, they covered their feet. And with 2, they were flying. Now, what's the picture here? You're trying to imagine some type of angel that is so bright that the word burning one comes to mind. But 2 of the angels, 2 of the wings are covering their faces. And the idea is something of that the dazzling splendor or glory of God is so bright, it's almost like they need sunglasses. Or when we had our last eclipse, every mother in America was telling their children, don't look directly at the sun. Same type of picture. And then it says, and the 2, they covered their feet. And when I hear this, I think about the passage of Scripture we looked at a few years ago, Exodus 3, where Moses is in the desert and the burning bush is going on, and it's not consumed by the fire. And God says to him, take off your sandals, for the ground you're standing on is holy ground. There's something of what the angels, these seraphs, see of the need to cover their feet in the same way because of the holiness of God. And then 2, they were flying. And I think about, well, it's not just making a description about what they can do, but I sense something about they are ready to do his bidding. Whatever needs to be done, they're ready to do. That's the picture that Isaiah begins to see of God high on the throne, exalted, dazzling in display and glory. And then verse 3, they, meaning the seraphs, were calling to one another, holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. And the phrase Lord Almighty there is the one that means God's power. They see that God is holy. They mention this 3 times, which is the same as the superlative in our English language. This is the highest of what holiness can be. This is what it looks like in its purest form. It's the only character quality of God where people reference his quality 3 times in the superlative, the holiness of God. And then it's interesting to me that as the seraphs look at the holiness of God there, and they're blown away by this, is that they connect the holiness of God with something they've seen before. Look at the end of verse 3. The whole earth is full of his glory. The whole earth is full of his glory. Meaning, when we go out there and around the world and look at the different, and are doing the purposes of God all around the world, we see the display of his character in his creation. That's what's reminded them here. The Creator and the wonder of the painting that he has painted for all of humans. Paul has the same idea in Romans 1:20. Ever since the creation of the world, his invisible nature, namely his eternal power and deity, have been clearly seen in the things that have been made, so that man is without excuse. When I was a kid, and still as an adult, one of my favorite places to go is to Denver or Colorado Springs, and then up into the Rocky Mountains. And one of the places that I love to see is Pikes Peak. And that's Pikes Peak there. Pikes Peak has an interesting history. In the song that we sing on patriotic days, America, Purple Mountain's Majesty, the writer was talking about Pikes Peak as the writer was coming across the plains of Kansas into eastern Colorado and seeing the mountains in their purple color from a distance. Pikes Peak. Now, this picture is taken in summer, and you can see that even though it's taken in summer, there's still snow up at the top of the peak. Let's go to the next picture. There's a picture that's a little bit closer. Now, you can see that you can see the timber line where the green, the dark green stops, and above that is white, snow, rock. That's what's called the timber line. It is so high that trees cannot grow above that. There's just not enough air, oxygen for them to do that. But you get this sense of just wonder and grandeur as you look at the wonder of this. And this is taken from what's called the Garden of the Gods, which is also just a spectacular place. These large red rocks. And I think we have one more. Do we have another one? Yeah, there it is. Another picture of Pikes Peak. Now, I've been to the top of Pikes Peak as a kid. I've been to the top of Pikes Peak as an adult. And at either time, you can see, no matter what time of year it is, this Rocky Mountain spring water hurtling down the sides and in small canyons and riverlets and streams. And you have the dazzling blue sky that's almost is like a backdrop that sort of regales our regular life. It's something of what strikes the angels as they see here. And then something happens that probably Isaiah didn't count on happening at this, but verse 4 says, at the sound of their voices, meaning all these seraphs that are singing, at the sound of their voices, the doorposts and thresholds shook, and the temple was filled with smoke. Now, I suspect that in his vision here, he was terrified. Back when we had the Northridge earthquake, it happened in 1994, I believe, and I was up early that morning. It was Sunday morning, and I was at our office, which was not here. We were renting a little one-room office over at Culver and Walnut, up on the second floor, and I was over there early. The earthquake came at 4:30 on a Sunday morning, and I was at my desk going over my notes. And on that second floor, when the Northridge earthquake hit, that building was swaying back and forth, and I was terrified. I thought, this thing is coming down. Now, I wondered if I could make it down the little hallway, turn left, another hallway, and out onto the balcony, and then down the steps before this building came down. And the earthquake was so hard that I just dove under my desk. I had a very sturdy desk. And while I was down under that desk, about 5 seconds into that, while this thing is shaking, and I'm thinking, this building is coming down, the lights went out in our building. And it's shaking, and it is dark. And I am thinking, I may be going to heaven pretty soon. I hope they find the body someday. Isaiah is describing something of this, the doorposts and thresholds shaking. And then he says, and the temple filled with smoke. The only thing that I can relate to in this is that years ago when we were first married, we spent a summer in Streeter, Illinois, a small little town. And on the way home from work one day, it was about 5 o'clock, I was driving by and I saw a 2-story house where the second story was on fire. In a small little town of about 25,000 people, so I made a right-hand turn, pulled up in front of the house. Nobody, the firemen were there, police were not there, nobody was there. I was the first one there. I got out of my car, I raced up to the front door, and the front door was open. I ran in the house and I yelled out, is anybody here? And I didn't hear a voice, and then I saw a stairwell over to the side, and I ran over to the stairwell. I was going to run upstairs to see, but I was stopped in my tracks at the bottom of that stairwell, because in that stairwell was coming down this, what looked like a solid black flume of smoke, and it was almost like it was a creature just cascading down. They're all filling up that whole area, coming down, and once it hit the ceiling of the first floor, then that smoke just spread out. Dining room, living room, kitchen, like this. And it just came hurtling down from above and kept coming down. And I yelled up, is anybody up there? Although I thought by this time, if anybody was up there, they were already dead with smoke inhalation. And I went into the dining room, and I could see the smoke. I was watching the ceiling, and the smoke had filled the top of the ceiling and was slowly coming down this way. A foot, 2 foot, 3 foot. And I was slowly backing up towards that front door. I thought, now I see how people die of smoke inhalation. It wouldn't take very long. I yelled out a couple more times. Nobody was there, and I made it out the front door before the smoke overtook me. A few moments later, the fire trucks came and they worked on the fire. That was a terrifying experience. And something of that is happening, a different kind of smoke is happening here that fills the temple. And then there is an effect of all of what's happened, the grandeur of God, his throne, the holiness, the seraphs, the shaking and the smoke. There is an effect that is profound on Isaiah. Verse 5, he cries out, "Woe to me," which means judgment is coming. I'm doomed. I am ruined. I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips. And my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty. Now, when I think about the effect of all of this on Isaiah, in one way, I am really surprised by his response. And in a second way, I am enlightened by his response. And let me tell you what I mean. How am I surprised by this? I would say that if you lined up 100 men, and they were honest with you about the struggles of their life and what they deal with regarding temptation and sin, if they are confronted with a magnificent picture of the holiness of God, in such a way that their sin is directly in front of them, they see it as clearly as they ever have. Their version of verse 5 would be, "Woe to me, I am ruined, for I am a man of unclean thoughts and unclean actions." And for some, that would be, "I deal with pornography, and there are too many times where I am defeated. And I am tempted with adultery, or I have committed adultery, or I am a man who deals with coveting of another man's wife. I am a man who's lost his marriage and is divorced. And I live among a nation of people where adultery and sexual sin and pornography seems to be almost a way of life." And he would finish with, "And my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty." That's what you would expect to hear, but that's not what he says. And that surprises me. But then the second part of this is what I think is what is lightning. What is it that he sees? What is it that just mortifies him about himself and about his country? He says, "Woe to me, I am ruined." Why? "For I am a man of unclean lips." Unclean lips. "And I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty." Now, what is it about seeing the holiness of God, that he is other than we are, and virtuous, and a virtue that is bent on others rather than myself? And what would this have to do with unclean lips? And as I think about this, I think about, do unclean lips have to do with when I'm in conversations with somebody that I'm really more interested, without even knowing it, of having my needs met than your needs? That I want to feel good about me and I'll relate to you in a way that kind of makes that happen? And can I do that without even seeing it go on in front of me? Is there a self-centeredness that comes out in my relating? Or another way of asking this, we know there's such a thing as unholy thoughts and unholy actions and unholy words. Is there something like unholy relating? Isaiah, he's not talking about he had a potty mouth or a problem with cussing and cursing. He didn't have a problem with road rage or camel rage in his day. I think what he saw and he was mortified by was this area of self-centered relating that just goes on as a way of life that up until now he's been completely oblivious to. But now he sees it. A few years ago, I was talking to a couple that are middle-aged, and they don't go to our church. I don't think any of you know them. They're middle-aged, and they'd been married a few years, and they asked if they could meet with me. They needed some help on their marriage, and I said, sure. And so we met for the first time. We sat down, and I said, tell me what's going on. And she said, they were, who starts first? And so they were trying to figure that out, and she said, you start. So he started off. And he would share, and then she would share, and he would share, and she would share. He would share, she would share, back and forth for about 10 minutes. And after about 10 minutes, it was fairly obvious to me that the problem that they'd come in for was we have a problem communicating with each other. And they had demonstrated that, maybe without knowing it, in front of me for about 10 minutes, back and forth. And for her part, after about 10 minutes, what I picked up from her communication was he just won't open up with me. He won't share who he is. He has short answers, and I just don't, my husband that I fell in love with, he seems to have disappeared. And I just don't know why he won't talk to me. I feel so unloved. And she was quite distraught by this after about 10 minutes. And then I jumped into the conversation. Now, as I tell you this story, I want you to remember two things, please. In my opinion, every husband and every wife always have things to work on. I never take sides, or try not to take sides, when I am counseling people. We all are sinners. We all need help. Remember that. Secondly, you are only about to hear a snippet of this conversation. If you're taking up a defense for the ladies, I did talk with the fellow, as I usually do. So after about 10 minutes, I asked the husband, I said, what's going on with you as this conversation is going on? And he was kind of puzzled by the question and not really sure how to answer. And I said, well, what is the effect, not of what you're talking about, but how the two of you are communicating? And he said, well, this is kind of how it goes. Most of the time we try to communicate. I said, okay, well, I said, let me be more specific. In the 10 minutes the two of you have been talking about, she has interrupted you at least 6 times by my count. She has finished a number of your sentences. She has corrected you on how you saw things, and interrupted you numerous occasions as well. And what I wonder is, what effect does that have on you? She was not a happy camper with me. He said, well, I think I just get quieter and quieter, which is what he does and what most of us husbands do, unfortunately, in those situations. And she piped in and she said, well, I was just trying to clarify the situation because he was only giving you part of the situation, and I felt the need to clarify and to give you more of the situation. She was relating in front of me how they relate with each other. And I said, okay, well, let's pretend, or let's say that every fact of clarification that you gave about the nature of this situation was true. The what was true. How the two of you are communicating, how we communicate, always have an effect. What effect has your how of communicating had on your husband? And she said, well, what do you want me to do? Just sit here and say nothing? Meaning she did, again, with me now, what she does with her husband. She dismissed me. My words were of no matter. And so I said, she said, what do you want me to do? Sit here and say nothing? I said, no. What I would hope you would do, even now, is turn to your husband and say, did I really interrupt you 6 times? Did I cut you off? Do you feel corrected, scolded like a child? I hope you would ask those questions. But it doesn't appear that those are anywhere in your purview. Again, she was not a happy camper. She did what we all do. She was focused on her intention. Well, my intention was to try to give you the full view of the problem of our communication. All of us give ourselves the benefit of the doubt with our intention. There's no virtue there. The what they were talking about was what they were focused on. What neither she nor he could see was how they were communicating, was torpedoing this. And so then I said, I would really, if you didn't ask those questions of your husband, I would hope you would ponder this irony. You have told me that you have a legitimate longing, which I agree with, to have your husband's heart and for him to openly share with you and to engage with you in conversation. And yet the irony of this, the paradox is, it appears to me, or is it possible, how you're relating is torpedoing the very thing you want. After a while of a husband trying to put his hand out there and getting a small slap, almost every time, eventually, he just learns to put his hand in his pocket, so to speak. No, a husband shouldn't do that. She was not really happy with where this was going. But what I hope would happen is that somewhere on the line, she would have a moment like Isaiah did, where she would see that, is it true that I relate as a way of life, as a style of relating, of critiquing and criticizing and clarifying and jumping in and finishing his sentences? Do I do that as a way of life, as a pattern? And I think what she's going to see is that she does. We all have our styles of relating, that you can change the particulars, but they're all bent on self as a higher priority than you. And that's what torpedoes communication. Not the what of what we're communicating, and not my intention, it's the how and the effect that I'm having that we rarely look at and ask ourselves. If she does, she's going to see that this is a way of life for her, her style of relating. And it's become such a habit that she's going to realize, I do this without even thinking, which she did in front of me and with me. And it's just ingrained, and it will be so ingrained that it will seem to her like, but this is just who I am. And when she sees that, I'm going to say, no, it's not. And it doesn't need to be. And she will say, if she has a moment like Isaiah, woe to me, I am ruined, for I am a woman of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty. Now, right after Isaiah confesses his sin, notice what happens. Verse 6. Then one of the seraphs flew to me with a live coal in his hand. The seraph flies down to the altar where the sacrifice for sin is being made. And with a tongue, he takes a hot coal out of that fire of the sacrifice. With it, he flew over to Isaiah and touched my mouth, he said, with that hot burning coal. And the seraph said, see, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away and your sin atoned for. Now, I don't know about you, but if I saw a seraph, a burning one, an angel, flying with 6 wings, flying over to me with tongs and a hot coal in his hand and getting closer to my face, I think I'd be running out the door. But there's something that keeps him there, which I think is the holiness of God that he's seen. And when the seraph comes over those tongs and takes that hot coal and touches his lips, that coal is not meant to harm. That coal is meant to heal. And that coal is not meant to burn, but to cleanse. And then he adds, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away, your sin atoned for. Fact. Now, when did forgiveness begin? Forgiveness began the moment that he confessed his sin. Woe is me, I am ruined. I'm a man of unclean lips. Bingo! The very next thing that happens is I can see God sort of looking over at one of the seraphs and going, seraph runs right down, takes that coal straight across there. In other words, all of the process of forgiveness from the point of confession onward is done by God. There's nothing else that Isaiah does except stands there. The guilt is taken away. The sin, the seraph says, is atoned for. Nothing else needs to be done. Even the sacrifice made for sin was brought by somebody else. And then verse 8. Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, whom shall I send? Who will go for us? He's asking for a spokesman. And I said, here am I, send me. Now, this verse really, I think, is just as amazing as any of the others in this passage. Because Isaiah, out of his own mouth, has said, I'm disqualified to be a spokesman for God. I am a man of unclean lips. I am the last guy that God would say, I want you to go be a spokesman. And yet, God asked him that very question. Who's going to go? And I have a picture of God looking at him and going, who is going to go? Because now there's no question of qualifications. His guilt has been taken away. He's been cleansed. The only thing to do now is to go forward. And Isaiah realizes that, and he says, here am I, send me. Let's pray together. Father, would you help us to see your holiness, maybe as we've never seen it before, in this vision that Isaiah saw. The dazzling display of your character, the perfect nature of righteousness, virtue defined, intent on carrying out your purposes in the lives of other people at any cost to you. And that you are making us a people who want to be holy, including how we relate to other people. Less for how I feel about myself, and more for how I can advance the purposes of God in the people that you put in front of me.